Okay, well I thought today, as it's sort of an anniversary going back in years, that it's worth going back perhaps to the first transatlantic transmission of television, which was performed by John Logie Baird in 1928. And there it was all done by amateurs, because it was Ben Clapp who used his transmitter to transmit pictures across from his QTH in Coulsdon to another amateur in New York. And the Narrowband TV Society thought in 2002 that it would be nice if we could celebrate the 75th anniversary of Baird's achievement. So a group of us got together, probably about 6 of us in a team, Vic being another member of the team, and started in January of 2002 planning how we would achieve this on the same day as Baird did on February the 8th and 9th, 2003, whereas he did it in 1928. And in the Nbtv meeting that we had at Loughborough in April, we formed a team. In fact, there were 3 of us in the team who were basically down at Amberley, because we wanted to find a good site that we had access to. I mean, Baird took several months to achieve the transmission, and in fact it took us about the same time. We looked for a location, and we ended up with a location down at Amberley, which is near Arundel, and it's a nice museum there. I can plug the museum for you. But it had the facilities. It had a radio station down there, G2CP, Chalkpits Museum, which was as it was originally called, and now it's called the Amberley Working Museum. And they had a nice beam down there, which you might be able to see virtually in the centre of the picture. And you can see that was the beam aerial there. And but that proved unsuccessful, because as you can see there's a lot of trees behind, and America is sort of over in the far left hand corner. So they allowed us to use the Friends Centre here, which is a building that they use for various functions throughout the year. And when the museum closed in October, the end of October, they gave us access to that for the whole of the winter. And it meant then we could start setting up equipment, and we could start planning the aerial. And in fact, Peter Dodds, who is a member of the Amberley Museum, and he, as you know, he writes in Radcom. He's an aerial wizard, and he suggested we used a V-beam aerial. Now, the thought was to put up a V-beam aerial, which in fact would be from the top on this side. That Friends Centre is in a chalk pit, which is about 90 feet below the actual surrounding terrain, and luckily New York is in the opposite direction from this high mound of chalk. But the idea was to have the centre of the V-beam up at 90 feet, with both arms, which were 100 meters long, going out to give an angle, I think it's about 45 degrees, wasn't it, pointing towards New York. And then we'd have twin feeder coming down, which in fact would come down that steep slope, and at the bottom you can see the aerial tuning unit, which was built by Ted, G4JNU, and all in a sort of waterproof plastic box. And then there would be 100 meters of UR67 that would go back into the Friends Centre. Now, one of the problems we had was we had to get across this track, and although the museum's closed, there's still vehicles, because in this pit they store all the steamrollers and all the heavy bits and pieces. But luckily we had warning when that was happened, but we built a ramp, and you can see 1 or 2 cones there, and that sort of marks out, and in fact the cable was buried in this ramp. in fact, all went well, but what we didn't realise, behind you can see they're building the new restaurant. You can see the roof of it. And one day we suddenly found that the cement lorries were coming up into here to turn round. So it was a panic station to whip the wire out of the way and let them through. But anyway, that was sort of the setup there. And of course it involved making a lot of equipment. There you can see Ted, Vic and Peter Dodds looking at the ATU, and in fact Peter is a keen mobile man, and in fact he was testing the V-beam from his mobile, and I think he was working more stations from that than we were for a while. But this is inside the shack. We haven't got all the equipment here, but we started bringing it in sort of October, November time. And in the foreground, we've got the vestigial sideband transmitter for the 30-line picture. And in fact, I don't know whether, Vic, you want to say anything about that?
Yes, the problem with transmitting Nbtv over the airways is, of course, the bandwidth. You can't just use an amateur radio transceiver because of the limited bandwidth. So we had to devise a system that would actually convey the signal. Now, the problem is that Nbtv takes about a 9 kilohertz baseband bandwidth, which if we'd used simple AM, would have led to a bandwidth of about 20 kilohertz, which wouldn't have been very popular on the amateur bands. So we devised a system of vestigial sideband. I believe it's the first time that VSB has been tried on such a narrow bandwidth. And so we hurriedly made some transmitter kit that would transmit VSB and also be DC coupled at the same time. So on the left-hand side, you can see a pile of equipment, which is basically the VSB generator. And it's quite an easy matter to generate the signal at about 10 milliwatts, but then you've got the problem of bringing it up to 400 watts. So instead of going to the trouble of building a linear amplifier, I used an old FT101 and drove the signal into the driver stage. That brought it up to 10 watts. And then that is fed to a commercial linear amplifier, which is capable of 1.2 kilowatts on a single sideband. But of course, in linear AM VSB, it was only capable of running 400 watts peak white. So that was a system. But we did come up with quite a major problem in that we noticed there was chronic hum on the picture outgoing, and that was due to the way that the linear amplifier had been made. There was no center tap on the filament transformer, to be precise. And so we had to rapidly build an anti-hum modulator in the front end to overcome the hum that was on the signal, and that worked quite well in the end. So that was the basic setup. We originally thought we was going to be on 20 meters, but at the time the conditions got worse and worse on 20 meters, and we rapidly had to change to 15 meters. And so we had to rapidly make a new set of equipment to go on that band. So that is the setup we used.
Okay, think of it. Okay, that's covered the then we had an SSB talkback station. Well, I say it was talkback. We only had the one aerial, so it was a case of swapping the aerial lead over. But that's pretty straightforward. Sideband, again, through a linear running up to 400 watts. And we had a 2-meter sort of local talkback, so if one of us was round the site, then we could do something about it. We could keep in contact. Then we go down. This is, if I go back to there, you can see on the right-hand side, we've got the 30-line station. We've got two ways of doing it. This is the electronic version where we've got a camera looking at 3 pictures, and when Baird transmitted originally, he transmitted his call sign, which was G4JNU and we had the special event station GB2KZ, and then you could pan round. He showed himself, so there's a picture of John Logie Baird, and he used his famous ventriloquist dummy Stooky Bill, which was in shot most of the time. And then we had a mechanical setup as well, so that we could do it the authentic way. And then you can see in the middle a mechanical camera. And you can see the subject on the right-hand side, and a 30-line scanner which was monitoring what's going on. Okay, so we got this set up just before Christmas. We'd made contact with an amateur in New York, but unfortunately he wasn't able to receive to get committed, but he knew a man who would, and that was a chap called Ed Gable, who was a member of the AWA museum over there, which was ideal because it meant now we were transmitting one museum to another, the chalk bits to the AWA museum. And he had an R1000 receiver, which is a good receiver for using for 30-line television because it has a wide bandwidth of either 6 or 12 kilohertz. And we'd worked out a little mod that we use on it, so you pick up directly from the diode detector, DC coupled, to give you a 1-volt video signal out, which drives all our apparatus that we got here. The only thing is he didn't have a televisor, and it was suggested by one of our members that I was sent out there with an original Baird televisor and use that, but the fact that Ben Clapp was out there setting up his equipment for months, the thought of being stuck out in America and having to transport a valuable piece of equipment over there, it didn't go down too well. So I thought the thing to do is to make a replica. Now this is a replica of a Baird televisor that was made by the Daily Express in 1934, and it came in kit form. And you had a box about this size and in it with all the bits to make up a televisor. So I thought, well, that's ideal. If I make a replica of that, then it can be shipped across via Wells Fargo and end up in New York. So that's what we did. And luckily, one of the members of the Amberley Museum had an original Daily Express kit televisor. So on one of our Thursday jaunts down to Amberley, because that's what we did every Thursday from October through to February, apart from Christmas, we went down every Thursday to do a little bit more setting up and a little bit more fine-tuning. So one of those visits, I disappeared for an hour or two with a camera and a rule and took all the dimensions that I needed to make the replica. And in fact, that is a replica of the Daily Express kit. So that was sent across to America. In fact, when it got there, we had contacted Ed on the SSB, and he sort of made our hearts sink for a moment because he said, should both the side brackets be the same shape? And we thought, well, what does he mean by this? But it turned out that one of the side brackets had got sort of folded into a V, but he managed to straighten it out because he had a very good workshop and good facilities. So that's what they were using in America to pick up the signals. So this was probably I think it was the Thursday or 2 weeks before February the 8th, 9th. And at that date we hadn't received or sent decent signals across to America. And the three of us came from different directions. I said Amberley is near Arundel. Vic had to come from Leighton, North London, through the Dartford Tunnel, wasn't it? Ted wasn't so bad. He was in Sussex, and I came from Reading. And we started out that morning, and it took you about 3 hours, and you were bound in your car half a mile away and walked in the last bit. It took me 2 hours. And when we got there, the time for contacting New York was about midday, and there was not a peep. The band was completely dead. We couldn't hear anything. So that caused us to, well, not panic a bit, but we then went in on the following Monday, and we got some quite good signals. But and it gave me actually an opportunity to take 1 or 2 photos. The fact that we couldn't do anything, I actually took photos, those photos you saw earlier, of inside the shack. Now, the pictures aren't brilliant, but this shows one of the pictures that was actually received by Ed in New York, and what he did, he emailed the wavefile file back to Ted in the evening, and we could display it and see exactly what we'd sent. So we did have two-way picture communication, even only one of them was by television. And that was Stooky Bill. The problem is taking photos when you've got a flickering picture which is going in and out of the noise and QRM. By the time you've got the camera set up, you've got it framed and you know what you're doing, it's faded out again. But the pictures received, if you were watching it live, were quite good. And in fact, that is the one of the better ones that we got, as I say, and that was received in New York. So I don't know whether there's really much more, there's nothing really much to explain about the Daily Express kit, because as I say, we'll have it on display in the other room later, and you can sort of look at it in detail. So I don't know whether I finish this now, and whether Vic wants to talk about his colour. So perhaps I'll hand you over to Vic now to talk about his colour camera, and then perhaps we can take questions after that, if that's the way to do it.
Yes, I'll just briefly describe my experience with colour TV. Just like in the old days of amateur television, when we were trying to get into colour, there are two main ways of achieving it. One is to be in the frame sequential method, and the other one is the parallel RGB method. Baird used the frame sequential method, as you probably all know, and he had a special disc which had three spirals, one for red, one for green, one for blue, with filters on each set. The problem with that method is that the colour flicker is pretty appalling, because it's 1/3 of the total frame rate. The method I'm using here is the alternative method, where it's a parallel RGB, so we've got RGB going into the monitor here. The disc is exactly the same as for an ordinary black and white monitor. It's the Nbtv 32 line 12.5 frames per second standard. So you don't actually need much more for a colour monitor. You need a RGB light source here, and I'm using red, green and blue LEDs, the 5mm high brilliance ones. There's a matrix of 6 of each in the colour light box. More recently, the Luxion types have become available, but most people are using those now, but they weren't really so readily available at the time I made this. And we also note that it's only in fairly recent years that the blue LEDs have become available, which has made this all possible. So, as I say, all you need is an RGB light source and 3 parallel identical amplifiers for the video chain. Now, of course, having built your monitor, you need a source of signals, and by far the easiest way is to build yourself a little colour bar generator like that and get pretty colour bars, but of course that soon pales, and you want some real pictures. Now, I thought about this, and the way that I did it was to use a 4-channel 8-bit wave file. Now, those of you into computing will know that 4-channel 8-bit is a perfectly valid format within the wave standard. The problem is that there aren't many computers with a sound card, and associated software will actually deliver the RGB plus sound that we needed as 4 separate channels. So the method that I'm using, displaying today, I actually alter the header of the wave file so it looks like a 2-channel 16-bit wave file, and then record it as an audio CD. So to reproduce the pictures, I'm playing the special disc through a CD player, which you can't see around the back, and then using the digital output of the CD player to drive a decoder which reconstructs the original RGB plus sound signals which supply the monitor. So that very quickly, as we're running out of time, I believe, is the way that I produce this unit. Thank you. So.
Can we just stop?